Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we're doing something a bit different. We're going to treat the Roman Empire like a patient on the operating table. We want to diagnose the exact pre-existing conditions that led to its absolute demise. We so often look at ancient history as just a bunch of distant, dusty events, but today, we're looking at Rome's collapse as a massive, flashing red warning light for our own modern state stability and institutional resilience. So let's just ask the big question right up front. How exactly does an unstoppable superpower die? I mean, really think about it. How could a civilization that eventually controlled half the known world, boasting unparalleled engineering, massive military might, incredible civic organization, how does that whole shebang eventually just crumble into dust? Well, the core lesson from all our historical sources boils down to this. Power creates greatness, sure, but only stability makes it endure. The truth is, Rome wasn't just murdered by some single overwhelming enemy. Actually, scratch that. It wasn't murdered at all. It succumbed to internal instability. It was this perfect storm of disasters that slowly, painfully tore the world's greatest empire apart from the inside out. To conduct this historical autopsy, we're going to quickly walk through 6 key areas. The myth of a sudden collapse, the immense burden of being a superpower, the political chaos and civil war that followed, the economic ruin and inequality, the external pressures that dealt the final blows, and finally, what all of this actually means for our modern world today. All right, let's jump straight into section 1, the myth of sudden collapse. A slow bleed, not a sudden death. So, modern historians actually refer to this era as late antiquity, and that's important because Rome was the victim of a centuries-long slow bleed of systemic rot. It was a really complex metamorphosis. The empire gradually transformed from the ancient world into the medieval one, rather than just poof, instantly vanishing into thin air and some spectacular blaze of glory. Now, you might be familiar with the year 476 AD. It's super famous for the Germanic king Odoacer deposing the very last Western emperor, a guy named Romulus Augustulus. But our sources actually show this was merely the final, pathetic whimper of an already decimated state. Honestly, by the time Odoacer took over, the Western emperor had so little military, political, or financial power that it was basically just a symbolic demotion. The real collapse, that had been happening for centuries. Moving right along to section 2. The burden of superpower status. This is about when incredible size actually becomes a fatal liability. To put things in perspective, at its peak around 117 AD under Emperor Trajan, Rome ruled an astonishing 70 million people. That's a massive number for the ancient world. Its territory stretched across 3 continents, all the way from the freezing, wind-swept hills of Britain down to the scorching, endless deserts of Egypt. They projected an absolute aura of invincibility. But here's the catch. Without modern technology, no smartphones, no satellites, no internet, this massive scale created an absolutely impossible logistical strain. A message from one side of the empire to the other, that took weeks, sometimes months. So when enemies attacked, frontier reinforcements arrived way, way too late. Local governors increasingly had to act completely on their own, which, as you can imagine, severely fractured any sense of central authority. And when you look at the military numbers required just to defend these massive borders, it reveals a dramatic vulnerability. Look at this breakdown of Diocletian's army. They maintained nearly 390,000 infantry and over 45,000 men in the fleets. Sustaining literally hundreds of thousands of soldiers placed an unimaginable financial burden on the state. The empire was quite literally becoming entirely too large for its own survival. Which leads us perfectly into section 3, political chaos and civil war. Or, as I like to think of it, when the enemy sits on the imperial throne. 20! That is the number of emperors who violently cycled through power in a span of less than 50 years. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome entered this devastating period known as the crisis of the 3rd century. Sitting on the imperial throne back then was basically a death sentence. Emperors were just routinely, brutally assassinated by their own rival generals. Talk about a revolving door of leadership. The symptoms of this crisis were everywhere. Instead of fighting actual external threats, Roman armies were busy fighting other Roman armies. Precious resources were completely wasted on these bloody civil wars. Widespread bureaucratic corruption took deep, profound root everywhere. And the emperors themselves became totally isolated from the daily realities of their people. Unsurprisingly, public trust simply evaporated. Okay, let's hit Section 4, Economic Ruin and Inequality, the fatal cycle of ancient inflation. So as the empire finally stopped expanding, the flow of new wealth and captured resources basically dried up. But those massive military defense costs we talked about, those kept rising. To pay the bills, desperate Roman leaders started debasing their currency, literally reducing the amount of precious metal in their coins. Well, this caused the purchasing power of gold to absolutely surge. Prices skyrocketed, and ordinary people's savings were just decimated by runaway inflation. It was a total economic death spiral. And during this spiral, a really stark, uncomfortable contrast emerged. The wealthiest aristocrats actively dodged their financial responsibilities. They often secured immunity from taxation, hoarded their gold, and heavily influenced the church and state. Meanwhile, the ordinary citizen experience, they were utterly crushed by unfair taxes, their savings were ruined, and they were left footing the bill for a bloated, failing state. To show you just how bad it got, listen to this complaint. It talks about the intolerable weight of taxes and the universal corruption, which increased the influence of the rich and aggravated the misfortunes of the poor. This incredibly modern-sounding quote actually comes directly from a Roman captive speaking to Attila the Hun. He was literally explaining why he was happier living among the barbarian Huns than under Roman rule. Wow, I mean, it's undeniable proof that ordinary citizens had lost all faith in their corrupted institutions. All right, Section 5, External Pressures and Final Blows. Nature, disease, and desperate migrations. As if things weren't bad enough, this already weakened empire was then just battered by compounding external catastrophes. Rome's vast, amazing trade networks unwittingly created an interconnected disease ecology. It unleashed devastating pandemics like the Antonine Plague and the Plague of Cyprian. Add to that the severe climate change of the late antique Little Ice Age. This disrupted agriculture and radically accelerated mass migrations all across the continent. And about those famous barbarian invasions, they weren't always organized military conquests. Often, they were desperate mass migration crises. Powerful nomadic groups like the Huns swept across Europe, forcing entire fleeing populations to push into Roman territory. A politically fragmented, materially depleted Rome simply lacked the strength and discipline to integrate them, which ultimately culminated in the shocking sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410 AD. Finally, Section 6, Lessons for Modern States, the Mirror of History. Now what's really fascinating here is how easily these Roman diseases map directly onto the vulnerabilities of any modern superpower. Just look at this comparison. Currency debasement that directly parallels our modern fears of runaway inflation. Aristocratic tax evasion perfectly mirrors today's debates over extreme wealth inequality. And Rome's overextended borders, they look an awful lot like modern geopolitical overreach. History doesn't just tell us where we've been. The symptoms are remarkably similar right now. Ultimately, our sources teach us that power might create greatness, but it absolutely cannot sustain it on its own. True institutional resilience requires a few core pillars. You have to maintain equitable economic structures so all citizens actually feel invested in the state. You must prevent systemic political corruption, adapt proactively to environmental and demographic shifts, and, above all else, ensure unshakable leadership legitimacy. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought. If the absolute greatest superpower of the ancient world could rot from the inside out due to corruption, inequality, and overreach, are our modern institutions truly resilient enough to avoid Rome's fate? It's a chilling question to ponder. Thank you so much for exploring the past with me in this explainer today to better understand our future.